Hi, I'm Diane Ellor, and I teach beginner and intermediate watercolor here at Reston Community Center. Today we're going to do a small painting of a beautiful subject, 3 roses. I'd like to say it's a simple painting of roses, but the closer you look at roses, you find there's nothing really simple about them. Those of you who have taken my classes know that I really like to encourage you to make a lot of starts and not necessarily to finish or think too much about your finished product, but every once in a while we want to be able to frame something. And for most of us, that means doing it economically. So I want to point out one thing that I've done with my start to my painting here, my drawing. I have taped the edges to give me the boundaries of the painting so that it will fit in a pre-cut mat. And you'll see that more closely later. That's a great strategy when you think you would like to mat and frame something. If you can use a pre-cut mat and keep in mind your painting size while you're doing it, you're going to save yourself some money and some hassles. Now, as we start on a painting, it's always best to do some studies, which I have done, just some pencil sketches. You can see here a simple line drawing, blocking in one of the roses, a compositional sketch of the 3 roses, and a similar sketch down here. Doing this work ahead of time will really help you understand your subject, and it'll make the final painting and the whole experience a lot better. Another thought for a watercolorist in the next kind of a study you might do is to do a color study. In this color study, which is very loose, I've thrown a ton of color in here. It's not exactly how our final painting is going to look, but this is my inspiration going forward. So why don't we go ahead and get started on the painting? So as we get started on our painting, I'm going to point out that I have done a really simple pencil sketch. This was actually the result of working with a lot of my preliminary studies to try to figure out what is the best way to do these roses, what's the most interesting way. And what I realized is that having the 3 roses together so that the colors blend together and they form a mass of yellow and other shades is going to be the best way to do this. I've also laid in just a very simple warm background, so it's going to be quite a warm painting. Mixing interesting colors in watercolor, it can be a challenge. One of the things that I like to tell my students and that I really like to do as I'm painting is I love to take the base color. So in this case, let's go ahead and let's say it's this cadmium yellow. We've used a lot of this in our painting. And I like to add 2 colors to it. Sometimes it will be a cooler and a warmer. Since we're staying very warm for this painting today, I'm just going to add some shades to it that continue with the warmth but take it in a slightly different direction. So to my little pool of cadmium, I'm adding the even warmer Indian yellow. And these are all Winsor Newton paints. These are paints that I encourage for students to get because they're very consistent and will really give you some good results, though there are many other fabulous brands out there. So I mix up a warmer yellow there. And then I also want to have the option of a yellow that has a lot of peachy color to it. So the alizarin crimson comes in. And now I have a peachy color. So once I get these various shades here on my palette, I can pick these up and use them on my painting in different spots. A highlight might be yellow. A warmer spot in the nook of a rose might be this warm color here with the alizarin in it. It gives you some variety when you mix a good amount of a varied color on your palette. What I like to do is you can take this yellow, you could use this for a highlight on a rose or on one of the petals, and at the same time you can easily reach down and pull up some of this beautiful alizarin peachy color here. And you could use that in the nook of the rose, in a little bit of a deeper portion of the rose, to give it some depth and a variation of color. Once you mix all of these, they're very handy for you. And if you mix them and use not too much water, but enough that you've got kind of a nice juicy palette, then you're ready to paint, as opposed to dipping into some dry paints. Now let's talk about mixing some of these greens. Greens are a wonderful color. They're a challenge and a problem in the sense that green can just come on as being way, way too strong and dominate your painting. But if you say take, again, some cadmium yellow, it's one of our base colors for the painting, and let's just take a small amount of our cobalt blue. That gives a nice green there. Let's reach into our ivory black. Reach in here. Now we've got some greens that are very subtle. They're not like something coming out of a tube, which would really overwhelm this. We want the green to play just a supporting role in these flowers. Interesting thing to do with green, reach in, pull out a little bit of red. If you can get some of that red in your greens, using it sparingly, you can set up a very, very nice, kind of a very natural looking green. They're complementary colors, but in nature you will find that you've got some reds hiding right underneath your green. As a matter of fact, that's what fall tends to be all about. So here's one way of putting out some lovely color on your palette, mixing it, even though you're really only using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 colors. You've got a nice range of options here. And you could even go cooler, darker. You can come over here and go warmer and very neutral over here. And have a whole range of colors ready to put on your painting if you plan ahead. So as we start our painting, I want to point out that I have already done a very simple pencil sketch. And I came to the idea of doing the 3 roses together as a way to really create a massed shape, as opposed to a single rose. I think the massed shape is much more interesting. And I came to that decision by doing those preliminary studies, including the color study. Also, I've laid in a very simple, warm background. It's going to be quite a warm painting. You know, our warm colors are our oranges, our reds, our yellows. Some of our greens can be quite warm. There's a warm green, a cool green. There's a warm and a cool for every color. So I'm going to have to be mindful of balancing out all that warmth by using some blue very judiciously in the painting as well. Another thing I want to point out, and I'm going to hold this up for you briefly, is that I have a very limited palette. Again, this comes out of my preliminary studies. I realized I needed to get tube green off my palette and only mix greens. So let's go in and get started. I'm going to work a little bit with my largest brush. And I'm going to use cadmium yellow. And I just want to reinforce some of those yellow passages that are quite clear with yellow. I see a nice clear yellow right here on our edge there. And have lots of yellows where we have the light picking these up. A little bit here. And then for this piece, I'm going to put some yellows down in there. We work really from our lighter colors are lighter values to the darker values. So now I'm going to go in and get some of my Indian yellow, and I'm going to mix it in with my cadmium yellow. And I'm going to actually stick with this large brush for a bit. I'm going to take out some of the extra water, just so that I have a little bit in the tip, and begin to pull in some of these darker, warmer yellows. The sheer variety of yellow in any color, really, once you begin to look at them, is amazing. Now, this rose in the center has quite a lot of that color to it. And we're even going to push that a little bit more. We're going to add some reds in there. But let's just really begin with this beautiful variety of the yellow. I'm going to leave a little bit of the paper showing through because I love the idea that we can come back in a bit later and add there. I'm going to start putting in some of the darker pieces here. Just lay that in a little bit. We've got quite a dark right there. Not going to get that entirely right now. I want to shift the color a little bit as I'm moving over to that far left rose, because we're very, very yellow here. So I'm going to, into my mixture of cadmium yellow and Indian yellow, which is really quite nice and light, I want to pull just the tiniest bit of alizarin crimson, just to give that a little bit of reddishness. And alizarin's actually a bit cooler. Now, I don't want to put a really strong, heavy glaze on there, but I want to just pop some of that in the center. And then I want to surround that with some more of this yellow. Now, as I'm doing that, I'm going to begin to think and work on the edges of the roses. Because with roses, we have a lot happening. We not only have that beautiful swirl, it's almost like a tornado in the center of that rose, but we have lovely shapes on the edges of the rose. And we really need to capture both. And the challenge that I find is being able to come in and capture it without overworking it. So let's just get some of those interesting shapes on the edge of the roses here. I'll leave that be for the moment. I've switched to a smaller brush. I'm going to put the large one down for a little while. And let's work on this shape back here of this rose. Pull some of that down like that. Up here. Now, I'm going to move into some of the cooler areas of the roses before I begin to work on the greens. And that is going to be done by shifting a little bit towards green and pulling some of this yellow color into some cobalt blue. You can use French ultramarine as well. We're just going to put that little bit of coolness here. Pop a little bit up there as well. Let's try to tie that together. I'm going to let that bleed a little bit. Now, as we work the back part of that rose, let's remember at the same time, we need to make the shape of the rose, the edge of the rose next to it. So we'll dig in, we'll do that. Now, this morning, as I was preparing to work on this painting, I was working on my color studies. And I was using what I call a tube green, your hookers or your Viridian was hookers. I was using that to mix my greens. I realized that in this setting of color, that tube green was really going to be too strong, too harsh. So I have a green started here and mixed, but I'm also going to mix some other subtle greens here. I'm going to use yellow with a tiny bit of black. Now this kind of a green is going to be much more subdued. I'm going to use a bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of black. It's a lot more subdued. And then for the sections, if I want to bring in a little bit more color, I'm going to bring in some of this blue. I'm doing that really because I want these roses to stand out. I do not, and I want this green to read as part of the roses. I really don't want this to be about a lot of very bright green color. I find that kind of, in this particular painting, I think that would be a little bit distracting. Pull a little more of this blue here. Now the challenge with watercolor is making those lovely shapes on the exterior of your flower or whatever object you're painting, your tree, your face, and then also creating the object at the same time. So what we're going to do, we're just going to work it very slowly, kind of gently. I think keep it really pretty understated. Now, one of the really great things that you can do with your green that you've mixed, take a little bit of red. In this case, it is my alizarin crimson. We're going to drop a little bit of that in here because, very honestly, that makes for an interesting green. I'm going to drop a little bit of that there. Let's green that up a bit more. And as we do this, we're also going to, now you notice it's a glass jar. So I'm going to leave a little bit of this beautiful rim for the jar, but then draw these shapes below it. Now at this point, now that we're moving into that glass, I really don't want to be overwhelmed by that green. So I'm going to pull some of these colors in here. I'm going to switch up the shape of this rose a little bit to bring that down here. Again, the idea is I don't want this to be about the stems, though we've got to have them. Now, we come down here and we've got a line where we see water, and we're going to just really suggest that. And we're going to suggest some of these shapes in here. And just work really simply. I'm going to be coming back to that later. Let's take that like that. And one thing I might do, I'm going to just pull out a little bit of detail here. And I'm going to come back to that a bit later. But as you can see, we've built some of this blue here around the area of the glass. And I'm just going to subdue that a little bit. And we'll let that dry. Now at this point, I'm looking at my background and I'm thinking, I'm going to cool off a small bit of it. So what I'm going to do with that is just reach, get a little bit of blue. I really just want to do a very simple glaze over here. Just to push this area back a little bit. Okay, now, you notice I have not been working on the roses for a while. They're a bit drier, which is good. You know, periodically it's good to move from one area of your painting to the next because you've got to be able to have that flexibility to come back and allow things to be dry if you're ready for that. If I'm going to put in a little more detail and shape in these roses, I need a little bit of dryness or all of the paint will run. That's one of the great things with watercolor, when you can control that to give you what you want. When you're interested in seeing some of that lovely running shape, or such as in here, or in here, or if you want something sharp, your water levels will help you control the way you do that. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to clean off some of my palette because I'm going to need to mix some darker warm colors and cool colors to use within the roses. So I'm going to go back again to my Indian yellow. I'm going to pull a little bit of burnt umber, mix on one side. And I'm going to pull a little bit of the alizarin crimson and mix that on the other side to give me a bit more of that peach. Now, as I look at these roses, I see the most intense color in that central rose. And so I'm going to begin to put some of that in there. And at the same time, try to keep some of that lovely detail in the rose. Don't so much necessarily want to see individual petals, but I do want to see that we have a lot of, beautiful stuff happening there, a lot of shape. A little more of that red here. To pop some of that red in here like that. And that really in the middle of that rose is where we've got a lot of that beautiful color. I'm going to point it in that way a bit. Now, interestingly, as you move back to the outer petals of that rose, it's not as necessarily warm in there, and you start seeing a little bit of coolness. And that's where we're going to pull in some cool bits on the edges. And what I'm going to do really clean up another spot on the palette, is I want to mix a nice cool lavender. Here's where you have the opportunity to really get some of this to pop rather beautifully. So I take the blue, which is a cobalt blue, just a really small bit of the alizarin crimson. We're using just a very small number of colors here. And I'm going to work with this fairly gently. If I squint, I can see that there's a little bit of coolness happening down here. Yeah, that's beautiful. So we begin to drop a little bit of that color in. And additionally, there's a little bit of it happening here as well. And if I come back here, I can see some of it happening there. And really the effect that we start getting is the color working together. As I stand back, I want to link some of these shapes and bring up in here. And I want to add a little bit of dark purple in here to try to come back to that center of the rose where we have a lot of interest. It becomes that pushing and pulling of how much of the detail do you want to have in your painting, how much do you need, and how much do you want to build. I'm going to move from this rose over here to this one. And I'm going to make it a bit simpler. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick with some of these softer colors. So raw sienna. I'm going to put a little bit of alizarin crimson in. And I'm going to, again, mostly work these internal bits of the rose. Now I want to keep that rose a little bit more neutral. So I am seeing some dark bits, but I think I am not going to go too crazy with too many of those petals. Let's bring a little bit of this brown up in here. It's great to have a good point on your brush when you're working with some of these little details, because what it lets you do is it lets you just really use that little point and pick up some of those details. Now, there is a coolness in here and a darkness. So I'm going to use a little bit of this green. But I really do want to keep it kind of loose. Now we're going to move a little more over here to this rose, and I think I'm going to let that be even more abstract. A little bit lower down in that hierarchy of these values and of the color. Now this is a nice little petal that's coming out like that. Now, as I step back, I love the wild mix of color here. I'm going to need a little tiny bit more detail in those roses, but not too much. What I do think I want to do at this point, though, is I want to go in and I want to capture a little more of the shape around the roses. And I think what that's going to do for me is that's going to pop these roses out a bit. It should keep it still nice and loose, but if I can just add a little bit of darkness to it and a little bit of coolness. And so what I'm going to do, I want to keep this a little warmer here, but I'm going to continue cooling this. And as you can see, I'm cleaning off my palette. Now this is a student-sized palette, so really you don't need a huge palette. You may if you want. You don't need a lot of colors on your palette. And as a matter of fact, as I worked on my studies today for these roses, I realized that fewer was much better. I want to grab just a little bit of this cobalt blue. And honestly, I want to add a little bit right there. But mostly let me mix enough. Because I'm going to be doing a wash. And when you do a wash, you really do want to have enough. And it's just going to be a simple cobalt blue. I'm not mixing two colors together. Now I want to capture the top of the petals a little bit better. Here's what I'm going to do. Make your life easier. Because when you're running a wash, you want to be able to let the water drip. If you're working flat, you don't need to do this as much, but if you're not, you probably want to go ahead and you can go ahead and flip. Your painting. And then always work from the wet portion of the paint going to the dry, because what you're trying to do is you link the wet portions. That will prevent that blossoming sort of a mistake that can look beautiful, but generally no one wants that in there to be too prominent in the background. And I don't want to go too crazy with this, but I do want to give some distinction to these edges of the roses. And interestingly enough, I encourage you with your roses, don't always think of roses as being soft and puffy, give them a couple of hard edges. Give them a couple of square edges, and give them a little bit of a sharpness to them. And we're going to put some sharp lines in the roses when we finish them up. Let's just touch that. All right. Yeah. I like this being a little on the warmer side. So let's just gently blend with water, really, and not so much with the paint. Yeah, I'm going to use my smaller brush and really just trace around the edges. Do some softening here. And then we're going to come in and we'll begin to really finish what we've got going. Keeping in mind that it's got some nice softness here. Using just a wet brush, now is a great time in your painting to come back in and just touch in a few places where things might need to be. Just gently sort of united. One place where we really need a little more of something happening is in here. And I think really the cure for that is going to be pulling in some of the red. And actually, I'm going to lift a teeny bit out. I want to get a little more variety. If you'd like to lift something from a painting and it's still wet, a tiny bit of paper towel. There, yeah, I like that. And allow a little bit of that. Just pick up pigment. If you have good paper, good watercolor paper, that should be no problem. And now that I've done that, soften a little bit here, soften a little bit here, and let's go in and let's mix up just a nice dark green. So we're going to use cobalt blue, darken it further and make it more neutral with the black. And then let's use that Indian yellow. We've used a lot of Indian yellow in this painting, and I think when you stay with just these few colors, it helps give you a color unity. I'm just going to drop a few spots of real dark in this painting, in our greens here. I don't want to do too much because I don't really want that focus there. But add a little bit, makes it interesting. I want to reinforce just a little bit of what's happening over here. This is where you stand back on your painting and take a look. I'm going to add a little bit more for the reflection. Here in our water. And now there are a few spots where I think I'd like to just pop in some nice pure yellow. Pop some right here. And there. Now I'm going to stand up here. I'd like to create a little more of a division right there between those two. And that's going to require something fairly dramatic. So let's come in and let's do a little bit of blue there. And let's pull in just a little dark here. And then I think really I'm going to come back in and just do some final touches. And then we'll take a moment and evaluate what we've done and see if we want to do any more or if we're feeling like we've got it. And let's do a little more yellow there. So we've taken a moment or two and allowed our painting to dry. One thing you might want to do when you're at this stage is you might want to use a hairdryer. You could also simply set it aside. Ideally, once your painting is at this 95% finished place, it's also a great idea to set it and walk away. Put it somewhere where you see it for a few hours or a few days, and then decide what you want to do. Sometimes, as you get away from a painting, you see things that need to be changed. Other times, you see things that you love and you want to emphasize. So I'm going to take a couple minutes just to switch up a few things in this painting that need to be tidied up. I'm going to soften. I'm going to use a very hard brush, and I'm going to just soften this piece right here. I find that a little too distracting in this area. I'm going to soften that as well. When you have good watercolor paper, it's wonderful what you can do with a simple flick of a brush. Do you like this? I'm just going to give it the slightest softening. I'm also going to use this nice hard brush just to give me a little bit of cleanup on some of these edges. Lift up a little bit of that color. And I want to lift up a little bit right down here as well. Being able to make these little fine changes at the end can really help you get control over that painting and pull that control back to you. I'm also going to soften this bit here as well. And as I'm looking at this, I'm seeing that one thing I do want to do, I'm going to let that dry a little bit in there before I go back into those flowers. I'm also going to soften a little bit up in this area where we have a transition in the wash, and right here. And then as I come down on this edge right here, I like the way it's still pretty loose, but I do want to give it a tiny bit more structure. So let's just reach in like that, because I am seeing a little reflection on the edge of that glass that I think is really quite pretty. And we can pull that in, soften that. Yeah, that I love. Now, one thing I do want to do is I'm seeing quite a dark piece right here. And I do think we need that on this rose. And it's actually a little bit cool. So let me just touch, make sure it's not wet. just going to layer in a little bit of cobalt blue and burnt umber. Because I'm really seeing that rose having that large shadow, and then one here as well. And then last thing I would like to do, I'm going to just darken again this piece here. Now that we have a little variety in that part of the painting. And we can pull that down like that. Now with roses, you can spend a lot of time trying to put in those petals. But I think at this point, we're in a good place. But again, I would look at this painting, I would put it up on a wall, and I would spend some time with it. I might come back in and I really might decide that I would like to push that background back further by putting in a glaze of blue or a bit more here. And that becomes very personal. If you like to have more detail in a rose, you could work this rose again. I think that's perfect. If you like a more abstract rose, you could certainly come back in and you could soften this area even more further. I think, honestly, I think I'm probably at the point with the painting where it's in good shape. I mean, if I was sitting at home, I could noodle it for like 20 minutes. But, lift a little bit here, work a little bit there. But I feel as though I'm probably at a place where there's not too much more I could do with it. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you've had some fun and that you'll try this at home. Please join us at Reston Community Center. There's a listing of classes at restoncommunitycenter.com, and we'll look forward to seeing you here. Thanks. Bye-bye.